September 26th, 1983, just past midnight. Deep inside the top-secret Serpukhov 15 bunker, a piercing, deafening alarm shatters the dead silence. On the main terminal of the Soviet early warning system, massive red letters flash a single, terrifying word: start. The Oko satellite network is reporting a direct hit. An American Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missile has just launched from a base in the United States and is screaming toward the Soviet Union at 24,000 kilometers per hour. The officers in the room freeze in absolute horror. Then, a second warning blares. A third, a fourth, a fifth. The system confirms it. 5 nuclear warheads are inbound. In less than 30 minutes, they will detonate, vaporizing millions of people and turning cities into craters of radioactive ash. At the center of this unfolding nightmare sits a single man, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov of the Soviet Air Defense Forces. According to strict military protocol, he has a maximum of 15 minutes to pick up the red telephone, alert the Soviet High Command, and trigger a massive retaliatory nuclear strike that will wipe the United States off the map. He is trained to obey without question. He is trained to report the data exactly as the machines present it. But what if the top leadership is already dead by the time the missiles hit? What if the command structure collapses? This exact paranoid fear gave birth to the darkest, most highly classified secret of the Cold War, the perimeter system, infamously known in the West as the Dead Hand. It is a fully automated, relentless doomsday machine. If activated, it is designed to measure radiation levels, detect seismic shocks, and independently launch a catastrophic, all-out nuclear counterattack, even if the entire Soviet government is already annihilated. No human intervention required. If Petrov makes that phone call, the wheels of this apocalyptic machine will start turning, and there will be no going back. In this windowless room, the fate of human civilization rests entirely on Petrov's shoulders. He has to make a choice right now. Plunge the world into a thermonuclear holocaust, or trust his gut, break every rule in the military handbook, and do absolutely nothing, praying to God that the state-of-the-art billion-dollar computer system is dead wrong. Welcome back to Tsars and Soviets. Today, we are taking you straight into the most dangerous night in human history. We will uncover the chilling reality behind the Dead Hand doomsday machine and reveal how one Soviet officer's absolute refusal to push the button became the only thing standing between humanity and total radioactive extinction. To truly grasp the sheer, paralyzing terror that gripped that underground bunker on the night of September 26th, we have to rewind slightly. We need to look at the Powder Keg that was the year 1983. Historians universally consider it to be the most dangerous year of the entire Cold War, a period where the doomsday clock was ticking louder than ever before, perhaps even surpassing the infamous Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. By the autumn of 1983, all diplomatic channels between Washington and Moscow had essentially frozen solid. The relationship was not merely cold, it was fundamentally toxic. It was fueled by an intense, suffocating paranoia and a genuine, terrifying belief on both sides that the other was actively preparing for a sudden, preemptive nuclear strike. In the United States, President Ronald Reagan had taken a hard-line, aggressively anti-communist stance. Earlier that same year, he had delivered his famous speech openly referring to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. Reagan was aggressively expanding the American military apparatus, specifically accelerating the deployment of highly accurate Pershing II intermediate-range nuclear missiles across Western Europe. These new missiles were a terrifying prospect for the Kremlin leadership. They were fast, they were deadly, and they could reach Moscow from bases in West Germany in a matter of 6 to 8 short minutes. This left the Soviet High Command with practically zero reaction time. To the aging, highly suspicious Soviet General Secretary Yuri Andropov,
a man who had formerly headed the KGB. These were absolutely not defensive measures. In the deeply paranoid eyes of Soviet intelligence, the United States was deliberately moving its chess pieces into position for a decapitation strike, a sudden, overwhelming nuclear assault designed to completely eliminate the Soviet government and its command structure before they could even pick up the phone to issue an order to retaliate. The paranoia inside the Kremlin was so severe and deeply rooted that the KGB and military intelligence had launched Operation Ran. This was a massive, unprecedented global intelligence gathering effort dedicated solely to finding the subtle signs of an imminent American nuclear attack. Every single Soviet spy operating in the West was suddenly tasked with bizarre, desperate missions, monitoring blood banks for unusual activity, tracking the daily movements of low-level government officials, and literally counting the lights left on late at night in Western military headquarters. The Soviet Union was a tightly coiled spring, fully expecting the sky to fall at any second.
And then, just 3 short weeks before Stanislav Petrov's fateful shift, a tragedy occurred that pushed the world over the absolute brink. On September 1st, 1983, a civilian airliner, Korean Airlines Flight 007, tragically strayed off course and flew deep into highly restricted Soviet airspace near Sakhalin Island. Genuinely believing it to be an American spy plane probing their coastal defenses, the Soviet military command scrambled a Sukhoi-15 interceptor. The fighter jet locked on and fired 2 air-to-air missiles, blowing the Boeing 747 completely out of the sky. The strike killed all 269 innocent passengers and crew members on board, including a sitting member of the United States Congress. The international backlash was ferocious and immediate. The United States publicly condemned the act as a deliberate massacre, an act of unparalleled barbarism. The Soviet Union, cornered, defensive, and fiercely defiant, accused the U.S. of using civilian passengers as a human shield for a CIA provocation. The rhetoric reached a fever pitch. There was absolutely no trust left, no goodwill, and no communication. It was an environment of absolute hostility, a world where any computer glitch, any radar misunderstanding, or any sudden movement was practically guaranteed to be interpreted as an outright act of war. This was the terrifying, highly combustible world that Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov walked into when he clocked in for his night shift at the Serpukhov-15 bunker. The Soviet military machine was already operating under the terrifying assumption that an American first strike was not just possible, but imminent. All it needed was a spark. All it needed was a single machine to whisper the word, "Start." The Serpukhov-15 bunker was buried deep underground, a heavily fortified concrete tomb designed to withstand the very apocalypse it was built to predict. The air inside was stale, smelling faintly of ozone, heated electronics, and the nervous sweat of the men working the night shift. This facility was the absolute nerve center of the Soviet early warning satellite network known as OKO, which literally translates to eye. Its sole, terrifying purpose was to stare unblinking at the North American continent, relentlessly searching the dark background of space for the intense infrared heat signatures of American Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles launching from their underground silos. On the night of September 26, 1983, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was the duty officer in command of the bunker. Crucially, for the survival of the human race, Petrov was not a standard, hard-charging frontline soldier trained to simply pull a trigger on command. He was a highly educated software engineer and a seasoned, deeply analytical data specialist. He intimately knew the very computer systems that surrounded him, including their complex algorithms, their hidden flaws, and their unpredictable temperaments. The shift began with suffocating, quiet routine, and then the system screamed. A harsh, blood-curdling siren suddenly cut through the low, monotonous hum of the server racks. A massive red screen illuminated the dim command room with a single, terrifying word: start. The computer was reporting with the absolute highest level of certainty that an American nuclear missile had just launched. Strict military protocol dictated that Petrov had to verify the signal and instantly pass the warning up the chain of command to the General Staff and Soviet leader Yuri Andropov. In the suffocating, paranoid tension of 1983, an alert passed to the Kremlin was practically a guaranteed trigger for a retaliatory nuclear strike. Petrov had a window of only a few agonizing minutes to make the call that would dictate the survival of the human race. As he stared at the glowing red warning, his analytical mind raced. He immediately demanded visual confirmation from the satellite operators on the lower floors. They reported seeing nothing but black space through their optical lenses, but the computer remained incredibly insistent. The system's reliability algorithm stated the threat level was absolute. Before Petrov could even begin to process the first apocalyptic warning, the siren pitched even higher. A second launch was detected, then a third, a fourth, a fifth. The giant electronic map of the United States flashed violently, showing 5 separate nuclear warheads arcing across the globe, heading straight for the Soviet Union. The glowing word "start" on the main screen abruptly morphed into a far more terrifying phrase: missile attack. The system had officially moved from a preliminary warning to a confirmed, ongoing apocalypse. The countdown to impact was less than 25 minutes. Panic erupted in the control room. Dozens of highly trained officers stared at Petrov in dead silence, waiting for the order to pick up the red telephone. The pressure was unimaginable, a physical weight crushing his chest. But Petrov hesitated. His brilliant engineer's mind began to desperately piece together the fragmented logic of this nightmare. He remembered a core, fundamental principle of Cold War nuclear strategy. If the United States were truly going to launch a preemptive first strike, a decapitation strike meant to completely obliterate the Soviet Union's ability to fight back, they would never send just 5 missiles. They would send a 500. They would send 1,000. Launching only 5 missiles was a suicidal provocation, not a tactical victory. It completely defied all basic military logic. Furthermore, Petrov knew that a computer system, no matter how advanced and expensive, was still just a machine built by fallible men. The powerful early warning radar installations on the ground, which looked directly over the horizon, were entirely silent. They wouldn't be able to physically see the missiles for another few minutes due to the curvature of the Earth, but the total, blind reliance on the raw satellite data felt deeply wrong to his analytical brain. He held the fate of the entire world in his trembling hands. Every single instinct drilled into him by the ruthless Soviet military machine screamed at him to follow the rules, to pass the buck up the chain of command, and to let the Kremlin decide. But he knew with terrifying certainty that doing so meant the end of the world. In a moment of unparalleled courage and mental clarity, Stanislav Petrov made his choice. He picked up the heavy receiver of the phone connected to the duty officer at the Soviet Army headquarters. He did not report a nuclear missile attack. With a voice that was remarkably steady, he reported a system malfunction, a false alarm. And then he put the phone down, sat back in his chair, and waited in the suffocating silence. If his logic was wrong, in 15 minutes, he and everyone he had ever known would be vaporized in a storm of atomic fire. As Stanislav Petrov sat in that suffocating bunker, watching the agonizing minutes tick by, he understood a terrifying reality that few people on Earth even knew existed. He knew exactly what awaited at the other end of that red telephone if he had chosen to report the launch. He knew that by passing the buck to the panicked, paranoid Soviet leadership in the Kremlin, he wouldn't just be asking for their advice. He would be feeding data into a monstrous chain reaction that could awaken the ultimate doomsday machine. In the West, whispers of this apocalyptic weapon eventually became known as the dead hand. Inside the highest, most classified echelons of the Soviet military, it was simply called Systema Perimetr. And it was, without exaggeration, the most terrifying piece of technology ever constructed by human hands. To comprehend the sheer horror of the dead hand, you have to understand the fundamental fear driving the Soviet High Command in 1983. The Kremlin was paralyzed by the thought of a decapitation strike, a sudden American nuclear attack that would instantly vaporize Moscow, eliminating the General Secretary, the Ministry of Defense, and the entire military command structure before anyone could even give the order to fire back. The Americans had Pershing II missiles in Europe that could reach Moscow in just 6 minutes. A human being simply cannot process information, verify a global threat, and coordinate a retaliatory nuclear war in 6 minutes. So, the Soviets built a machine to do it for them, a machine that would ensure absolute, unavoidable revenge, even if every single person in the Soviet Union was already dead. If Petrov had reported the 5 incoming American missiles, the Kremlin leadership, terrified and completely out of time, might have activated the perimeter system before fleeing to their deep underground bunkers. Once activated, the dead hand was designed to take complete control. It was a sprawling, fully automated network of heavily fortified sensors spread across the vast expanse of the Soviet Union. These sensors were specifically engineered to measure 3 things: massive spikes in background radiation, intense flashes of light indicative of nuclear detonations, and catastrophic seismic shocks. If the system's core computers detected these apocalyptic conditions and simultaneously registered a complete loss of communication with the top military leadership, the dead hand would make a cold, calculated, algorithmic decision. It would conclude that the Soviet Union had been destroyed, and it would immediately initiate the endgame. Without requiring a single human fingerprint, the dead hand would automatically launch a specialized fleet of command rockets. These rockets were not aimed at the United States. Instead, they would fly high over the radioactive ruins of the Soviet motherland. As they soared across the sky, they would broadcast secure, unbreakable launch codes directly down to every surviving nuclear silo, nuclear submarine, and mobile missile launcher across the entire country. The system would bypass all human crews entirely, automatically opening the heavy silo doors and igniting the engines of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of intercontinental ballistic missiles. An unstoppable wave of thermonuclear fire would rise from the ashes of Russia and completely obliterate the United States, effectively ending human civilization. Mutually assured destruction, guaranteed entirely by cold, unfeeling circuitry. This was the unimaginably high stakes of Petrov's decision. If he had blindly followed protocol and passed that warning up the chain of command, the sheer panic in Moscow could have handed the keys of the apocalypse over to the dead hand. By choosing to sit in terrifying silence and trust his own human intuition over the multi-billion-dollar machine in front of him, he didn't just prevent a mistaken retaliatory strike. He kept the ultimate doomsday machine sound asleep. In the suffocating atmosphere of the Serpukhov 15 bunker, the clock ticked with agonizing slowness. Stanislav Petrov had made his decision. He had declared the incoming nuclear strike a false alarm to the high command. But declaring it did not make the flashing red screens go away. The system still aggressively insisted that 5 American Minuteman missiles were hurtling toward the Soviet Union. According to the computer's calculated flight time, if Petrov's human intuition was wrong, the first thermonuclear warhead would detonate over Soviet soil in roughly 15 minutes. Those 15 minutes were undeniably the longest, most terrifying moments of his life. He sat frozen in his chair, outwardly projecting absolute calm to his panicked, sweating subordinates, while drinking a glass of tea that felt like dry ash in his mouth. He knew that if a flash of blinding white light suddenly consumed the bunker, he would at least have the grim, fleeting satisfaction of knowing he made a mistake for about a millisecond before being vaporized. 10 minutes passed, then 15, then 20. The giant electronic map continued its silent, horrifying countdown. And then the predicted time of impact arrived. Nothing happened. The concrete walls did not shake. The secure phone lines from Moscow did not go dead. The over-the-horizon ground radars, which would have finally picked up the incoming warheads in their terminal atmospheric phase, reported absolutely clear skies. The flashing red warnings on the main terminal abruptly vanished, replaced by the dull, familiar green glow of the standby screen. The crisis was over. A collective, shuddering sigh of relief swept through the underground control room. Petrov was right. The billion-dollar machine was wrong. He had just saved human civilization from total annihilation. But how could the absolute crown jewel of Soviet military intelligence make such a catastrophic, world-ending error? The subsequent highly classified investigation revealed a mechanical flaw so bizarre it felt like a cruel joke played by the universe itself. The OCO satellite network relied on highly sensitive infrared sensors to detect the massive heat signature of a ballistic missile launch. However, on the night of September 26th, a perfect 1-in-a-million celestial alignment occurred. The early warning satellite was in a highly specific position in its orbit just as the sun was rising over the United States. High above the American state of North Dakota, precisely where the Minuteman missile silos were located, there was a dense layer of high-altitude clouds. The sun's rays reflected off the tops of these clouds at the exact angle required to completely blind the Soviet satellite sensors. The computer's rigid algorithm interpreted these intense, localized flashes of sunlight as the massive thermal exhaust of 5 launching rockets. A simple, cosmic trick of light had almost triggered the end of the world. You would think that a man who single-handedly prevented a global thermonuclear holocaust would be hailed as a supreme, untouchable hero. You would expect him to be given the highest medals the Soviet Union had to offer. But the Soviet military machine did not reward independent thought, and it certainly did not tolerate deep systemic embarrassment. Initially, Petrov's commanding general praised his cool-headedness, but as the investigative commission dug deeper, the narrative rapidly shifted. The powerful scientists and elite generals responsible for designing the flawed early warning system were furious and deeply defensive. Admitting to the Kremlin that their colossal multi-billion ruble project was dangerously defective was absolute career suicide. They needed a scapegoat. They needed to immediately shift the blame away from the infallible machine and onto the flawed human. They couldn't officially punish Petrov for preventing World War III, so they punished him for paperwork. The commission formally reprimanded the lieutenant colonel for failing to properly fill out his military logbook during the chaotic, terrifying minutes of the false alarm. They argued he had a phone in one hand and an intercom in the other, but his diary entries were incomplete. It was a humiliating, completely absurd bureaucratic excuse. Petrov's promising military career was permanently derailed. He was quietly reassigned to a less sensitive post, deliberately passed over for promotion, and eventually forced into an early, uncelebrated retirement. The man who saved the world spent the next several decades living in a cramped, ordinary apartment in a Moscow suburb, surviving on a meager military pension, strictly forbidden from ever telling anyone, even his own wife, what he had done on that terrifying night in 1983. Stanislav Petrov's extraordinary story remained buried deep within classified Soviet military archives until the very end of the Cold War. It was not until the late 1990s, long after the total collapse of the Soviet Union, that the terrifying truth of that September night finally leaked out to the global public. When the Western world finally learned exactly how close they had come to total radioactive annihilation, Petrov was suddenly thrust into the international spotlight. The quiet, unassuming retired officer was flown to the United Nations, showered with prestigious international peace awards, and finally recognized across the globe as the man who literally saved the world by doing absolutely nothing. Yet, until his dying day in 2017, Petrov humbly and consistently refused the title of hero. He simply insisted that he was just a man doing his job, and that he merely happened to be the right person with the right analytical mind, sitting in the right chair at the most critical moment in human history. But the chilling legacy of the Serpukhov 15 bunker extends far beyond a single night in 1983. The dead hand system, that relentless, unfeeling doomsday machine, was never truly dismantled. Military analysts and intelligence experts widely believe that an updated, heavily modernized version of the perimeter system is still fully operational today, quietly waiting in the dark, constantly monitoring, and ready to execute its apocalyptic programming if the unthinkable ever happens. And this terrifying reality brings us to a critical, profoundly unsettling question for our modern age. Today, we are eagerly handing over complete control of our lives, our global economies, and our advanced military defense networks to increasingly complex artificial intelligence algorithms. We are actively building machines that are infinitely faster, smarter, and more powerful than the crude early warning computers of the Soviet era. But if a modern, state-of-the-art AI defense system suddenly told us that the end of the world was exactly 15 minutes away, would a modern military officer have the supreme courage to defy it? Would they have the raw human intuition to question the absolute data, break every protocol, and risk everything on a gut feeling, just like Stanislav Petrov did? Or would we simply trust the machine, follow the algorithm, and blindly push the button? Thank you so much for watching this episode of SARS and Soviets. If you want to uncover more dark, hidden secrets of the Soviet Empire and the terrifying reality of the Cold War, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new documentary. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think a highly advanced modern artificial intelligence could ever make the profoundly human choice to save the world? Or are we currently building the ultimate doomsday machine? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and I will see you in the next video.